Ladies and gentlemen, please stand as the Howard University Air Force ROTC Color Card presents Colors. They will be followed by Kiana Kelly Futch, Miss District of Columbia Outstanding Teen, who will sing the national anthem, followed by the Negro National Anthem. Lift every voice and sing.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty that are rejoicing roars high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the roaring sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the day that hope unborn had died. Our weary feet come to the place on which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our wearies, God of our silent tears, Thou hast brought us thus far on the way. Thou hast by thy might led us into the light. Keep us forever in the path, we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy head, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Please give a warm round of applause for the Howard University Air Force ROTC Color Guard and Miss Kiana Kelly Futch for a wonderful opening to this morning's National Town Hall. Please welcome to the stage ALC co-chair, Congressman G.K. Butterfield.
Good morning. It is my pleasure and privilege this morning to welcome you to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation 2019 Annual Legislative Conference. You know, sitting in the holding room out there, you don't have an appreciation for the audience that you're going to see when you walk on stage. But just look at you. You're here ready to participate in this town hall meeting. Thank you so very much for coming. Let me also thank the talent that you've been observing here this morning. They are very talented individuals, and we thank them so very much. And we certainly thank the distinguished panelists who will be participating in our town hall today. I've been asked to report and update this morning Congressman Richmond, who is the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and Congresswoman Karen Bass, who is our CBC chair. We're looking forward to being here with us this morning, but they have been called to the Hill to sit on a Judiciary Committee hearing. And you know what I mean. But they asked me to pass on their very warm regards, and my ALC co-chair, Congresswoman Frederica Wilson of Florida, is also unable to be here with us today. So I will be holding down the fort this morning. At least it will give me another minute or two to make remarks. But this annual legislative conference is a highlight of the year for many of us who have the privilege of serving in Congress. We fight for our constituents and for the good of the nation. Most days sitting in offices and government buildings and at home in our districts. It is hard work. It is hard work, but it is fulfilling when we see progress in our communities and more equity in our government. It is fulfilling to me as a representative for the 1st District of North Carolina to see the progress that we are making. This conference, ladies and gentlemen, is our unique opportunity to see a representation of our broader constituency. As a member of the CBC, I not only represent my district in North Carolina, but also serve Congresswoman Bass's constituents in California. Yes, I do. Congressman Richmond's constituents in Louisiana and Ms. Wilson's constituents down in Florida. When we come together here with all of our constituents and partners, we become a village. And so it is my pleasure to recognize the theme for this year. It is a very, very important theme that we labored long and hard to reach the theme, but it is so fitting. Beginning in 1619, 12 million African slaves were snatched from their homeland and shipped across the Atlantic in chains. 2 million, you may have read this in your history books, 2 million did not survive the passage because of disease or suicide. Over the decades that followed, 600,000 plus Africans were purchased at slave auctions by Southern plantation owners. The U.S. Constitution became effective some 170 years later. First slaves came 1619. The Constitution became effective 1789, 170 years later. At the time of the ratification of the Constitution, there were 700,000 Africans or their descendants living in bondage in the United States of America. Legally, they were considered chattel or personal property capable of being bought and sold, mortgaged or leased, or even given as a gift. Can you imagine? The framers of the Constitution in Article 1, Section 9, explicitly protected the slave trade for 20 years. Now, if you didn't know that, don't feel bad, because I did not know it until 4 or 5 years ago. Written into the original Constitution of the United States of America, slave trading was protected for 20 years, at least 20 years. Article 5 said this clause preserving the slave trade could not be modified even by a constitutional amendment. This section said effective January 1st of 1808, 20 years later, Congress could pass a federal law to entirely abolish the international slave trade, although individual states could eliminate slavery at any time, and some did. The state of New York is an example. On that day in 1808, Congress abolished the transatlantic slave trade, but did not abolish chattel slavery. At that moment in 1808, the slave population had increased. It is now 1.2 million slaves living in the United States of America. Through the transatlantic slave trade, though the transatlantic slave trade was now illegal, slave owners were allowed to retain their slaves. The size of the slave population did not decline. It actually increased by the year 1860. When 1860 came, there were 4 million slaves living in the South. That was the year that Abraham Lincoln was running for president. The Southern states feared that Lincoln would take away their slaves, and so the Southern voters did not vote for Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. Immediately, 7 states left the Union. After his inauguration, 4 additional states left the Union. A total of 11 states left the Union, formed their own country called the Confederate States of America. They elected a president, a vice president, created currency, created a militia, did everything that a country does. And a brutal civil war broke out between the North and the South. Finally, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln, very weary of the war, signed a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which said to the Southern states, I will give you 100 days to come back into this country. If you are not back by January 1st of 1863 and participating in the Union, I'm going to sign a permanent executive order. I'm going to sign an executive order freeing the slaves in the states that are in rebellion against the Union. Southern states defied Abraham Lincoln, and sure enough, on January 1st of 1863, Lincoln did all that he could with his executive power to end slavery. But legally speaking, the termination of slavery was in dispute. And so finally, on January 31st, after Lincoln was reelected, of 1865, the Congress of the United States passed the 13th Amendment. But as we all know, constitutional amendments have to be ratified by the states. There were 36 states in the Union at that time, and so it would take 27 out of 36 states to ratify the 13th Amendment. And so the 13th Amendment started going around to the states for ratification. While the ratification process was taking place, Lincoln was assassinated just a few blocks from where we sit right now. But finally, on December 6th of 1865, when the state of Georgia ratified the amendment, 4 million slaves became free, thus ending 246 years of chattel slavery in the United States of America. That is the history. That is the history that we talk about this week. 400 years, our legacy, our possibilities. Now that I've gotten that off my chest, and the staff didn't put that in the script, Lavonia Allison can tell you that's my speech back at home. And so I know it off the cuff. But anyway, I have the pleasure now of introducing to you the newest member of our family. He is the new Chief Executive Officer and President of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the hardest working man in Washington this week, David Henson.
You know, it's rare that you can get up in the morning, put on your clothes, come to a room, and then get a history lesson from one of our nation's leaders. Thank you, Congressman Butterfield, for your passionate leadership as co-chair of this year's conference and for your ongoing commitment to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's mission. Let's give him a round of applause. Good morning to all of you. It is gratifying to see this room full of energized people who came this morning to dive into the serious issues of our time. I'm especially happy to see so many young people here this morning who are engaged in making your voices a part of our national discourse. The Congressional Black Caucus Foundation's mission is to advance the global Black community by developing leaders, informing policy, and educating the public. The most important part of that mission is growing our pipeline of Black thought leaders, policymakers, and change makers. We accomplish this through our fellowship program, our internship program, scholarship program, and study abroad program. We provide access to the halls of Congress, private sector companies, the national and global nonprofit community. We believe that exposure, access, and training, combined with the passion and inherent brilliance within our young people, is a formula for a transformative future for our communities and our nation. The Congressional Black Caucus Foundation has placed thousands of interns, hundreds of public policy fellows, and we have dispersed tens of millions of dollars in scholarship funds. Many of our former interns and fellows have earned senior level positions on Capitol Hill, in government agencies, and in this nation's largest corporations. One of our newest congressional representatives, Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, was a former CBCF intern. For those of you from the state of Illinois, you should give her a round of applause. What's interesting, though, is that she served in the office of a young man who we once knew as Senator Barack Obama. So you could see the lineage that comes with working with members of Congress who have gone on to do great things, and in his instance become a president of the United States. But she beat out a Republican incumbent to represent the 14th District in Illinois. I am proud and excited to introduce to you the 2019 and 2020 cohort of Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Fellows, and they will be coming out and joining me right now. Our fellows include Francis Adilier, Finance Fellow, sponsored by Wells Fargo; William Bishop, Science and Technology Fellow, sponsored by Google; Chloe Brown, Energy and Environment Fellow, sponsored by British Petroleum; Michaela Daniels, STEM Fellow, sponsored by Amazon; Kevin Fashola, Donald Payne Foreign Relations Fellow, who also authored an amazing article titled How Russia Used Racial Divides to Undermine American Democracy. He's also sponsored by a number of corporations, including Prudential and Altria. Crystal Milam, STEM and Cybersecurity Fellow, sponsored by Facebook. Camille Moore, Energy Fellow, sponsored by the American Petroleum Institute. And last but not least, Taylor Ware, Congressional Fellow, sponsored by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Please give them a round of applause. But that's not all, ladies and gentlemen. We have research fellows. So I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Tiffany Howard, Small Business and Entrepreneurship Research Fellow, sponsored by Bank of America. And Dr. Afriya Zakia, Water Infrastructure and Workforce Development Fellow, Water Agency Leaders Alliance, National Association of Clean Water Agencies, and the U.S. Water Alliance. Thank you so much. An important distinguishing feature of CBCF interns and fellows is that they are paid opportunities. Unpaid internships, well, thank you. Unpaid internships, which are essentially the norm on Capitol Hill, are simply out of reach for many young people of color. CBCF paid interns and fellows are possible only through the generous support of our sponsors. So I want to take a moment and say that without our sponsors and the sponsors that are sponsoring this event, none of us would be here. I can't underscore enough the importance of paying young people for the work that they're doing to advance the country. And on that note, I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Procter & Gamble Company, for their generous support of this morning's event and this afternoon's town hall. I want to acknowledge the American Medical Association for their support as well. Dr. Patrice Harris will represent the AMA on the panel. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Baron Weatherspoon, Procter & Gamble's Global Vice President, Industry Affairs, and Corporate Race Initiatives, to the stage to say a few words. Mr. Weatherspoon.
Well, good morning, family. I want to start by thanking this year's ALC co-chairs, Congresswoman Frederica Wilson and Congressman G.K. Butterfield, and thanking every member of the Congressional Black Caucus for your leadership and steadfast dedication to improving the lives of the people in our Black communities through your public service. I'm excited to be with you this morning as we honor our history, celebrate the progress that we have made, and acknowledge the many deeply entrenched obstacles that still must be overcome to close the equity gaps that remain. We're looking forward to hearing from the panel today about how we can work together to ensure we continue to make the much-needed progress. Each of us as individuals and every organization that's represented here today has an opportunity and a responsibility to create a more level playing field and to help address the sustained racial disparities that continue to impact the Black community. We owe this to those who have blazed a trail before us. We owe this to ourselves. And more importantly, we owe this to our children and to the generations yet unborn. At Procter & Gamble, we are proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with each of you in taking bold steps to drive greater equity and equality for our people of color throughout this nation. Our aspiration is for an equal world with equal voices, equal representation, and equal opportunities for everyone. And that aspiration, I might add, is being fully supported with action. As the world's largest advertiser, we touch more than 5 billion people every day. It's why we take seriously our responsibility to portray everyone, and especially people of color, positively and accurately, not only in our advertising, but across media, film, and television. And while we work to ensure that the right diversity exists in front of the camera, we also focus equally on having the right representation behind the camera. It's why we created compelling stories of bias captured in short films such as The Talk and our new film, The Look. These films elevate the stories of everyday people and show the bias that our people face as they simply walk through their daily lives. We do this so that we can together work on addressing these biases and correcting them both individually within ourselves and systemically in our institutions. And it's why we are stepping up to lead a new effort called Take on Race. This effort is designed to ensure that corporate America is taking an even stronger leadership role in doing its part, focused on fundamental issues that we know impact our communities, such as access to employment, access to education, to economics, to health and human services, and yes, access to social and criminal justice. For the first time, next week in Cincinnati, Ohio, Take on Race is bringing together people from multiple companies across multiple industries to figure out what we can do together. And our work there will be about identifying current practices, but more importantly, scaling those practices across the nation. I'd like to close as I began by thanking you for all that you are doing and for being here today, joined together in this very critical conversation. I want to thank the leaders and everyone in your respective places for the roles that you play in helping our African American communities to realize our full potential and all the possibilities that could possibly be held in our dreams. Thank you and good morning.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have a special honor to introduce you to our moderator. She is the chair and 7th National President of the National Council of Negro Women, a living legend. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Janetta Cole.
My sisters and my brothers all, good morning. In the tradition in which I grew up in an African American church, we would say this is a great getting up morning. And it is because we have convened. We have come together to do exactly what that Adinkra symbol says we must do. Sankofa, a Twi word from a people in Ghana, says as it looks back over its back, it says, go back and fetch. Understand our history and her story so that we can be better prepared for the present and build for the future. No theme could be more appropriate for this convening than the one chosen. 400 years. Our legacy, look back at it, and our possibilities. Dates do matter, and yes, people matter, and yes, we Black people matter profoundly. August 1619, a date that is indelibly associated with the horrors of enslavement. We are the descendants of the African women and men who went through those doors of no return. And we have known personally or through our collective memory what the Equal Justice Institute correctly calls the unbroken line from enslavement to lynching to mass incarceration. But let us remember, my sisters and my brothers, we are also descendants of an enslaved people who resisted that enslavement. We are descendants of a people who were resilient and persistent and managed always to make a way out of no way. And so it is in that spirit that we look back at our legacy and forward to our future. It is now a joy, if I can use this expression, it's a pure D joy for me to bring forward our sisters and brothers of such distinction that you don't need long bios. You know each of them already by the serious work that they do. I warmly invite my sister friend, Dr. Julianne Malveaux. Dr. Malveaux, president and owner of Economic Education, and you know I'm going to add, former president of Bennett College for Women. Please join me with a special welcome for this Sister Doc. Dr. Patrice Harris, first president who is African American and woman, the first black woman president of the American Medical Association. I must say before this brother comes forward that I had the privilege and the joy of attending this year's convention of the organization that he leads. Doctor, I may be, but I'll tell you who you are. You are a righteous brother leader of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, Derek Johnson. My bro, coming now is Brother President Mark Morial, the president of the Urban League. And I need to say, Brother Mark, that you know, when you reach the age that I reached, you can't help but go back and hold on to the things that have been so meaningful in your life. And for me, among them is that I always knew I could count on knowing what was the state of my people in my country because of what your organization put out. Now, I'm kind of old school, so I'm trying to give it to podcasts and the other stuff. I remember when I could read it on a piece of paper. And then how special it is as all of us focus on a particular state, the state of Virginia, because that is where in 1619 the record reads 20 or odd Negroes were brought ashore as enslaved people. It was in a state that today has this African American woman as a state senator. Welcome, Sister Senator Jennifer McLean. Now, sisters and brothers all, I know I said we would start by my asking each of you a particular question, and then we'd move into the conversation. But time is short. So let's have a conversation right now. But somebody's got to open it up. Sister Senator, I think we're going to ask you to open it up by just beginning to say, what does it feel like right now in the state of Virginia?
Well, first of all, it is a pleasure to be here, and I can't help but feel the weight and the pride and the joy of our ancestors who arrived 400 years ago. And I think that outweighs everything. We are struggling with the same struggle over the past 400 years of how we make the ideals on which this country professes to be founded true for everybody. But you have to recognize that American democracy began in July of 1619 among only English white men. And then when Africans arrived a month later and were made property to serve those white men, and then English women were recruited to serve those white men, that the foundation of our democracy and all of the systems we continue to have today were based on that power structure. And we have struggled with, as Africans and other minorities have come together to create coalitions and rise in power, and there's been a swift backlash, and if you look throughout our history, that has happened. We are in that cycle right now. I can't help but be filled with pride at how far we have come, and frustration and sadness at how far we still have to go.
You know, when I was at the gathering convened by the NAACP, there was constantly repeated some words. When we fight, we win. Brother President, pick up on what the sister senator has said. Bring us a little further into time.
Thank you, and thank you for your history of leadership. NAACP, this year's theme, we adopted the theme of when we fight, we win. Recognizing this 400th year of the transatlantic slave trade, understanding that from the time Europeans hit the west coast of Africa, we fought. We not only fought to resist, we fought once we got to these lands. And even in the establishment of this country through the Revolutionary War, the first person killed in battle was an African. As you move forward, you got to understand that when the states began to fight over the economic question of slavery, that the Union was losing, but for Africans because they were not American citizens, they took up arms and they reinforced Sherman's army. And it was only because of that that Grant and Lincoln began to consider a military strategy we now call Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln did not free the slaves saved the Union.
Woo!
And as you move forward, that brief period called Reconstruction, we fought to create public education across the southern landscape and many policies that still exist today. Even when that period of redemption took place where the former Confederate soldiers who were traitors began to take up arms, on coup d'etats we continued to fight. Even when Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter, they met in Niagara to create what we now know as the NAACP 110 years ago. That was a part of the legacy of fighting. And so as we stand in this Trump era, we cannot give up hope, because every time we fight, we actually win. The problem with our community, we don't take on enough fights.
Come on.
And if we take on more fights, we are guaranteed to win because we know how to win.
Now, I know I can feel you needing to get in this conversation.
You do know me.
But yeah, I do know you. But Julian, be specific about how enslavement is the undergirding of America.
Dr. C, thank you for the question, Sister President. Thank all y'all for being here. Props to my fellow panelists. And the question is the pivotal question about the foundation of our nation. When those 20-odd black folks came here, they came here because, forgive my colloquialism, but white folks didn't want to work. And the foundation of the Southern economy was the fact that white folks didn't want to work. Who did the work? We did the work. And we did the work and we were exploited. The foundation of our nation is something called predatory capitalism. It's not just regular old capitalism, capitalism that thingifies people, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, makes people something less than people. And in making something less than people, you use them, Janetta, as collateral for loans.
Exactly.
So these southern plantations could not have expanded the ways that they did if our bodies were not used as collateral for loans. Our bodies are the basis of the bond market. Our bodies are the basis of Wall Street. Our bodies are the basis of the wealth that exists, all of the wealth that exists in this country. You would not have a United States of America but for the work of enslaved people. And this is something we don't want to deal with. And this is why the conversation about reparations is so extremely important. And I got to give props to my colleagues at NARC, the National African American Reparations Commission, and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who convened hearings on Juneteenth, where I had the privilege to testify. But we want to talk about why we have such a wealth gap in these United States. $1 black for every $13 white. Now, understand this. This is not much better than 1910, when it was $1 black for every $16 white. Why the stagnancy? Because at the end of enslavement, for about 40 years, black people, before Jim Crow laws, etc., we were accumulating. We didn't get our 40 acres and a mule, but as Brother President has said, we fought. We fought to establish schools. We had 110 black banks, 110 black banks at the turn of the century. Today we have 23. What had happened was?
What happened was?
They plotted, they changed laws, they changed banking regulations, they did everything they could, and the whole notion of the tallest nail, when black folks dared compete with white folks. The first lynching Ida B. Wells investigated was a lynching that happened because a man named Tommy Moss had the nerve, had the absolute temerity to open up a store that competed with a white man's store. The white man was like, what? I don't believe this, but the white man had a store. He had 10 citations for liquor. Now, this was back in the 18-something where you didn't do that. 10 citations for liquor. He had gambling in his store. He had prostitution running out of his store. Black women didn't want to go there. Tommy Moss said, let's start another store. It was called the People's Grocery. It competed with the white store effectively, so effectively that they plotted to try to get him out of business. Didn't work. Two little boys had an argument over some marbles. The white boy goes to the white man's store and says, the black boy stole my marbles, right? They go to the man's store with guns. They're going to shoot up a store over marbles. And the next thing you know, Tommy Moss and his two friends were lynched. This was Ida B. Wells' first lynching that she investigated. Tommy Moss was her goddaughter's dad. And he was the first black postman also in Memphis. Again, this was a high job. So these lynchings were really about economic envy. Some people would tell you they were about sex, they were about economic envy. But this economic envy was because enslavement had allowed folks to thingify us and to put out the trope that we didn't know how to manage ourselves, we couldn't do anything for ourselves. That period where we closed the wealth gap, not closed it completely, what, from $1 black dollar to 36 white dollars down to $1 black dollar for 16, it shows that we were competing effectively. And they were afraid of that. And so you see lynchings that were all about property. You see basically a suppression of our ability to do what we do, which is survive and thrive. But we kept fighting back, and she said kept fighting back. All too often, however, the power of the Klan and of laws basically prevented us from doing more than we could. I could go on, but I won't because she's going to cut me off in a minute. But folks, study lynching and understand that lynching was not about sex. Lynching was about economic envy and black folks who had self-determination and were willing to fight for our communities to survive.
Brother Mark, what words are in your heart and on your mind about our current economic position as a people in the richest country in the world?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for your incredible career, your inspirational leadership, as well as for your friendship. It's great to be here with all the panelists, and it's great to be with all of you. And I'm reflective a bit today because this is actually the 40th time I've been at a Congressional Black Caucus weekend. I first attended, I wasn't in my mother's womb, but I was a teenager in college and came here in 1978, and remember very distinctly how powerful that event was. It took place at the Washington Hilton, affectionately in those days known as the Booker T. Washington Hilton, and got an opportunity to meet the likes of Arthur Ashe and Ron Dellums and outstanding leaders that we all looked up to. I remember Stevie Wonder performed. Both Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter came to the dinner and spoke to the people there, and the conversation at that time was about the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Bill,
There you go.
which was a proposal by then Senator Hubert Humphrey and Black Caucus member Representative of Los Angeles Augustus Hawkins to pass a law which mandated as the policy of the United States for there to be full employment. Today, our progress is under a vicious assault. Everywhere we turn, whether it's in the courts, the effort to pack the courts with right-wing justices, the effort to roll back civil rights gains at the Justice Department, the Department of Education, or all across the board, there is an assault where it is most extreme and where it is most potentially dangerous is what is happening when it comes to voting. The effort to, in effect, suppress African American votes, to suppress the votes of our people, is an intentional, malicious, diabolical strategy being carried out today in this country. It's taking place in a number of places. It's taking place in state legislatures across the nation. Now, there's been an effort to push back in both the courts and with many legislators, but there's been an effort to suppress our votes, and it's had a great deal of success. The closing of polling places, the introduction of voter ID across the board, it's taking place in the courts, where the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, in striking down the Voting Rights Act and the Shelby decision. The Shelby decision is our generation's Plessy. It's our generation's Dred Scott decision in terms of the damage that it has done. And let me tell you where else it has taken place. Suppression of African American votes was the animating strategy of Russia in its involvement in the 2016 election. And I just want to share this with you because we need to know this. How did Russia suppress the African American vote in 2016? They masked themselves as black activists. They took on the identity of black activists. The most prominent Russian troll was an artificial woman by the name of Louisa Haynes. Louisa Haynes had hundreds of thousands of followers. If you would have looked at Louisa Haynes' Facebook page, she had a great afro, and there was a photo of her with her fist up.
Her fist.
And she wasn't nothing but a phony Russian troll. She spent 2 years polluting our community with messages of not voting. We should not vote. We should not participate. We need to send a message by not voting. Russia participated actively in the effort to manipulate us psychologically and to manipulate our young people into not participating in the 2016 election. And guess what? They're still active. And guess what? They're coming again. And guess what? They're going to use the same tactics. Get ready, ladies and gentlemen, because the stakes are so high in 2020 for every conceivable effort to trick, to deceive, to thwart, to suppress our effort to participate in the election in 2020. We have to be woke, not just in word. We got to be woke, and we have to be aware, and we have to say we will not be tricked, we will not be bamboozled. More than any other issue, our ability to impact the election of representatives who are going to undertake policies, whether it's a study of reparations that the Conyers Bill of 1989 calls for, the selection of Supreme Court justices, the balance between spending money on war versus investing in people, or tax cuts for rich people versus investing in schools or job training or housing for us. All of those issues are impacted by who sits in these seats in this town. And where our power is and where our power has to be exercised. I am tired of having intellectual arguments about public policy. I want some action. It's great to come here and envision great ideas, but not have the muscle to put them in place. We're at a time in 2020 where this generation, our generation, is on the line. And I tell you why it's on the line. We don't want to be the generation that hands over the torch of power to our children and have to look them in the eyes and say, you know what? You're worse off
Than I was.
There is a lot on the line. It's generational. We cannot allow this to morph into the end of the second Reconstruction period. That's what's at stake. So while we discuss whether it's what policy we want around schools or jobs, we can discuss it day and night. We can put papers out day and night. We can make noise day and night. But if we don't actualize it by showing up and voting, participating in electing some people to public office who are going to be responsive to us, we must exercise our power in 2020.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about not only what I and the organization I have the privilege of working with, NCNW, will do when it's time to vote, but here's what I've been thinking about. I've been thinking that any African American in this country who doesn't go out and vote, you know what I think I can do? I think I can call down the spirit of Fannie Lou Hamer.
Yes.
To come down and whoop them. Because when we think about what our people went through,
and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and
the
Martin DeLay
right
and Nat Turner.
vote.
Let's call them all down.
we're going to call them down. Now, I'm not going to moderate. Speak up.
Look, I want to say just one last thing. This is what I want to say because I want to address this head on because it needs to be addressed head on. I hear people say to me, well, I'm just not motivated by these candidates. I spent most of my life till I came to the National Urban League in politics. I served as mayor of New Orleans for 8 years. I served in the Louisiana Senate. I was 7 or 8 times a delegate to the Democratic National Convention and grew up in politics. Politics is not about romance.
Yeah.
This is not about a candidate. I have to be in love with them and be inspired by them to go out and vote for them.
Ooh, yeah.
I recognize that in the course of history, there are many instances where black people have had to choose between the lesser of two evils. So I'm not sitting there all the time. Would I love for a historic, inspiring figure to come along? Of course. But that's not my sine qua non for voting. That cannot be our but for voting. And I've said to people, said this on January 20th, 2009. There is only going to be one Barack Obama because there can only be one black president in the history of the United States. And so we can't get nostalgic, people, and start thinking and looking and saying, I've got a list of issues. If I can't check off that the person doesn't agree with all these issues, well, I'm just going to stay home and I'll spend my time on Facebook and Twitter. We have got to be smart about this and recognize that in this country, two things are respected: economic power and political power. Period. And they would not be trying to suppress the African American vote if they didn't think it would make a difference.
There you go.
So all I want to say, and I don't want to, keep on talking, but I do want to say that so much is on the line in 2020. See, we're in the trenches. There's this Twitter mania up here, insanity on Twitter, and we're distracted. Yeah. And then underneath, there are these policies: privatize Fannie and Freddie, put vouchers in at the Department of Education, don't bring any voting rights enforcement cases at Justice. And I could go on and on and on. And those things that are not on the front pages, those things that are not on Twitter, are the things that engender long-term damage. Those of you who were around in the Reagan era,
come on,
need to remember that the effect of Reagan was long-standing, long past Reagan. Those policies, some got rooted, and some of them got rooted so strong that they infected even the Democratic Party, with some of them were running around pretending to be Reagan light and Reagan like. So we have to know where we are. We have to understand that there's a lot at stake in 2020. And we need everyone to do their part.
You know, if you elect a clown, let me just quickly, if you elect a clown, expect a circus. Let me repeat that. If you elect a clown, expect a circus. So we have a circus on the front page every day. But in terms of economic policy, we're not paying attention to the fact that Betsy DeVoid, that woman who's devoid of good sense but runs the Department of Education, she has just given a treat to these for-profit colleges that exploit our people. We have seen regulation rollback, and Mark, you're absolutely right. This started with Reagan, who promised regulation rollback. Clinton tried to move it a little forward, President Obama a little forward, but then we have this man who's eliminating regulations by the minute, literally by the minute. He's appointing people to head cabinet departments who then go to industry. That's supposed to be against the law. He's bringing them from industry in. And then he has normalized both poverty and inequality with his rhetoric. What do I mean? Unemployment rate goes down. This man goes and has a party. Oh, the black unemployment rate is lower than we've ever seen it. But the black unemployment rate at 5.5% is twice as high as the white unemployment rate. If you celebrate the so-called low black unemployment rate, you're normalizing the fact that it's supposed to be 2 to 1. When the poverty rate went down, they announced yesterday or day before Tuesday, by 0.5%, Black poverty is 20.8%. When you celebrate the little drop, 0.5 in overall, you're suggesting that black poverty is supposed to be almost 3 times white poverty, and that we're supposed to have high black poverty. And we buy into that. They got these melanin-infused black buffoons who show up on television and say, and we're celebrating because our unemployment rate is low. You know, and we need y'all, all y'all, to push back. To push back. So Mark is right. It's beyond simply, we can't just be aware. We've got to push our legislators. We love them, but we got to push them.
And while all of
And please, come in.
is going on, black people are more likely to be uninsured and underinsured. Black people are living sicker and dying younger. Our babies are dying. Women are dying around childbirth. We're dying more often from heart disease. And so these are the issues we have to look at when it comes to health. The American Medical Association is very privileged to sponsor this town hall, and we really need to raise the conversations around health. We have to be willing to talk about some things we haven't talked about before. I am a psychiatrist. We have black women, black men, black children with increased rates of suicide. We are not talking about trauma. We need to talk about gun violence, but we need to talk about gun violence in an informed and evidence way. And I will say that anger and hate are not mental illnesses. And
Come on.
We have to make sure that we do not blame or further stigmatize those who have mental disorders. And this is particularly true in the African American community, because I think we can all admit that there's been some stigmatizing in our community around mental disorders, and I think that is one of the reasons we are having this increased rate in suicide. So again, it's about, and health, I would say, is involved in economics.
Yeah, very much so.
It's involved in community development. If we are not healthy, we cannot thrive.
Right.
And we have to make sure that mental health is integrated into overall health and not seen as an afterthought and a before thought.
Sister Doc, I read that the Association of American Pediatrics, or American Pediatric Association, finally in 2019 produced a report that says what we have known forever, that racism is harmful to our children. Now, how do we take that and do something with that? How do we avoid what Brother Mark says we need to avoid? No more policy statements, no more right. But that is a mighty statement to come out. That is a reality, that it harms our children and that they carry it for the rest of their lives.
That is unfortunately true. If you look at the number of women who are dying soon after childbirth, and we've all seen the stories, we've heard the stories of Serena Williams. So these are folks who have access to the best health insurance, the best physicians. And so there is this phenomenon that we are talking about called weathering. It's the day in, day out structural assaults, racism, discrimination for women, black women, both race and gender discrimination that actually affects our organs, affects our cardiovascular system, our immune system, our brains. And so yes, the first step is talking about it and identifying racism as a structural determinant of health that impacts those social determinants of health. In Atlanta, I'm part of a group, and I think everyone knows this work, and you could do this in your community. If you do the geomapping and you look at zip code data, and you know that you could live 10, 20 miles apart and have vastly different health outcomes. And in Atlanta, we did a project, and we overlaid the history of racial discrimination in housing, fair housing violations, over health outcomes, and it's almost a one-to-one correlation. So we have to look at these policies, but not just look at these policies, change policies. And I will say, if you want to change policies, you have to make sure that people are in office and are sitting in those regulatory spots who are willing to listen to the data, look at the data, and actually change the policies. I do want to say something about your Sankofa mention at the very beginning. It's very important that we look back before we go forward, and I would say certainly it's been an honor to me to be the first African American president at my inauguration. I talked about knowing in my heart that I was my ancestors' wildest dreams, but the AMA is looking hard at our own past. I'm sure folks know that many years ago, African Americans could not belong to the American Medical Association. But looking at that, we officially went on record to apologize in 2008, and said that was the beginning of our look. That wasn't the end. The apology was not the end of our work. And we are doubling down on that work. We just established a Center for Health Equity, and we're going to look at all these issues. We're not going to be afraid to look at how racism affects health, how implicit biases affect health, how the social determinants of health affect health. So we're very proud of that work. And again, you talked about the possibilities. I'm very proud to be a part of those possibilities moving forward in medicine.
So it's good that you have this Sankofa symbol up there. The Dinka word, that means go back and get it. Go back and get the legacy of who we are. And connecting the health conversation to the political conversation, we have successfully leveraged that reality through Freedom Summer. In Freedom Summer, you had the scenario where you had individuals like a Fannie Hamer and a Bob Moses and a Hollis Watkins and so many others who realized that what was confronting Africans in Mississippi and across the South was not disconnected, but all connected. So whether it was access to health care, labor rights, voting, quality education was all connected, and they came up with a strategy to force then the Democratic Party to acknowledge and deal with it by leveraging the votes and understanding the rules of engagement. And out of that came the rural medical health clinics. Dr. Robert Smith, he came up with that concept along with Jack Geithner and others out of the experiences of getting people to go and participate. Out of that experience also came a renewed fight on how to leverage our vote. If we talk about 2020, it's not enough to talk to a crowd of people here to say, we gotta go vote. Because I'm looking at this crowd, 90% of the people in this crowd are gonna go vote. That's easy, right? But for us, I recognize that we need to do a little deeper than that. We turn out at high numbers when it's the first black anything on the ballot. Right? Next year is almost going to be like a first black anything because folks want to get rid of the current president. But that's not enough. So we've invested in the data necessary so we can identify not the high frequent and moderate voters, but the low frequent voters, and then getting you all to go talk to your neighbors to go to the polls. Because it's going to be a 1-2% difference that's going to be the outcome. So we have to be smart about going back and get the knowledge of what brought us here and get away from the rhetorical conversation, talking to each other, and really get strategic. So for us, we're saying, okay, here are the populations. Here is the data. Join us in this process, all of us, because it's not about what organization is going to do it, because movements are not built based on organizational identity. Movements are not built on one generation versus another generation, one gender versus another generation. Movements are built on the reality that we must lean into our collective consciousness, because if we don't, the outcome could be much worse. So as we talk about these things, health versus this versus that, it's all in the same pot. It's driven by policy. Policy is driven by votes. And in a democracy, our vote is our currency. So let's talk about how do we leverage our collective currency for the outcome that we deserve and we desire.
So come in, Senator.
2 quick points. I know this is the Congressional Black Caucus, and yes, 2020 is extremely important, but 2019 is important. We have state elections in Virginia, in New Jersey, in
Louisiana, Mississippi, Kentucky.
And in Virginia, the majority is on the line. And if you don't think every single vote matters, the majority of the House of Delegates in 2017 was decided by pulling a candidate's name out of a bowl because it came down to one seat, and that seat was tied. And local elections matter. If you care about criminal justice reform, you don't just care about what Congress is passing. You care about what your elected prosecutor, how he or she is deciding to use their discretion. You care, your state governments and your local governments are deciding what gets taught in school. And you're exactly right. We need to go back and have an honest conversation about our history across the board. But who decides what's taught? Because I'm gonna tell you what, this backlash that we're fighting right now, we have 22 African American legislators in the Virginia General Assembly right now. Over 100 years ago, we had 22 African American legislators in a constitutional convention who decided Virginia is going to have free public education for everybody. We had over 100 African American legislators elected who put that in place. And then in 1902, when the white Southern power structure came back and then wrote a new constitution that disenfranchised black people, a lot of us didn't learn that in school. I didn't know there were 22 elected members of that constitutional convention until I chaired a commission 150 years later that happened to do research on, well, who was the first legislator in Virginia? Everybody thought it was Fergie Reed in 1968 because we don't know our history. And yes, racism and overt racism is dangerous. But you know what else is dangerous? Race ignorance.
Yes.
Race ignorance. And that is how you get a governor who doesn't know that blackface is offensive. And that is how you have people passing voter ID bills to require a birth certificate that don't know in their own state that people born as late as 1940 who don't have birth certificates because of decisions made in our history that we need to know about.
And so, folks, this is why the reparations conversation is so extremely important. It troubles me that when polls are done about reparations, well, I understand why most white folks don't like reparations. Although if they knew history, they might. But what troubles me is that the majority of African Americans also eschew the idea of reparations. We are not all in favor of reparations. Many of us say, well, why do you want to dwell on the past? Well, that past has had an indelible footprint in our present. And that's why we want to dwell on that past. It's not called dwelling, it's called fairness. If you stole my land 100 years ago, it was still my land and I want it back. And that's just that. If you stole my car 10 years ago, I still want my car back. Stuff was stolen from us. I mean, they just walked off and took our stuff. And essentially, that's why we end up with these disparities that we see. And the wealth disparity is a disparity that affects every aspect of our lives. But the reparations movement is not about just let's write a check to folks. It's also about repairing our communities. Our communities were hurt from every aspect, from the health aspect, as you've discussed, the economics, of course, the politics. But what about the psychology of a people who have been subject to the worst kinds of oppression? Let me tell you about another lynching. I'm not obsessed with lynchings, but maybe I kind of am. I'm writing something about black money, and so the connection between black money and lynching is there. So I learned about the lynching of Mary Turner. In Valdosta, Georgia, this was a story. There's a white man who was so mean that nobody would work for him. So the only way he could get workers is he would go to the jail, bail a brother out, and then bring him to his plantation and work him pretty much to death. There was never a clear definition of how much do I owe you, et cetera. So the guy would go and work, and then he might say, I'm finished, and the boy would say no. So a brother named Sylvester Johnson was beaten twice, once while he was ill. Sylvester snapped, got himself a nice little shotgun, and shot the mean man, and winged his wife. Well, in that community, in retaliation, any black man who had a connection to Sylvester Johnson was lynched. 13 men were lynched in a 2-week period. A young sister named Mary Turner, she was 19 years old and 8 months pregnant. Her husband was one of those lynched. He didn't even have a connection with Sylvester, but he was lynched anyway. Well, she when I read about her, I said, gee, I would have been a little bit like, she went down to the courthouse and gave them hell and said, somebody's going to pay for the lynching of my husband. They said they didn't like her attitude nor her message. So they tied her to a tree upside down. They doused her with gasoline, lit her on fire alive. After she died, slit her belly and the fetus came out, and they stomped the fetus. This was a signal to that community: do not open your mouth. Do not come to this courthouse. Do not protest anything. When I first wrote about Mary Turner, I wrote a piece called In Praise of Mouthy Black Women. She was punished for being mouthy, which means that all of us sisters, in honor of Mary Turner, need to open up our mouths every chance we get. But even more than that, what we must do is understand that the economic piece, of course, I'm an economist, so that's central to me, but the psychological impact of these things happening, and what does this mean to the way that people chose to resist? Derek, you or so many folks resisted. Just the NAACP's foundation, especially in the so-called integration of the schools in the South. If teachers were members of NAACP, they lost their jobs in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. They just took their jobs from them because they were members of a so-called subversive organization. Now, according to the FBI, Black Lives Matter is a subversive organization. Understand the use of these words by the use of folks who are in power, but also understand why this is why reparations in its broadest sense is important. Not just looking at money, but also looking at the damage to our communities and the suppression of our motivation. There's so many black folks. There's a book called Lynching, of course, but there's a book called Lynching in which this sister, who is a theologian, writes about how we didn't talk about lynching. Many people, she interviewed Dr. Cole, a lot of older people who lived in counties where lynchings had taken place. But folks would say, oh, that didn't happen here. Well, what happened is parents, to protect their children, didn't tell them about that kind of stuff. But what it meant is that there was also a obsequience, a subservience that came with being black. That you were just supposed to cross the street, shut up, because brothers were lynched in uniform when they dared not get out of the way for a white person. So folks, reparations is important, and I encourage you, please, to learn about it. Don't just say, oh, gee, that was back in the past. A lot of stuff was back in the past. Japanese intern people got reparations, they got paid. The Holocaust, I don't know how many times we've paid for that. I ain't mad at anybody. But I just want black folks to have a whole community which includes economic well-being, but also psychological, sociological, and health well-being.
Yeah. So one of the biggest issues we have to be able to embrace is successfully handling success. We've had so many victories. We talk about the horror stories of after Reconstruction, civil rights movement, but we had so many successes on civil rights. I use this example, I get beat up a lot, but Selma, Alabama was a failure. You had 2 attempts to walk across a bridge. John Lewis was heroic in his efforts. We commend, we praise him today, but Selma, Alabama in 1965 was 70% black. Mayor Smitherman was the mayor in 1965. It was 70% black in 2000, and he was still mayor. That's a failure. Heroic efforts, a failure. Right down the road was Lowndes County, Alabama. And in 1966, they won every election. And white folks who saw illiterate on the Alabama ballot, you list your party with a symbol, and the white chicken was their symbol, but the mascot of the black school was a Black Panther, so they listed the Black Panther, and they organized the black folks who wouldn't vote, and they unelected all the races that was in office. That's a success. We talk about Selma, we don't talk about Lowndes County. And we did not manage Lowndes County's success well, because from there, now it's time to govern. It's time to deal with policy, and all of the brains that came in to organize that, many of them went to the next fight, and we didn't send the brains down there to help that community manage that well to be the beacon of light. We had the same reality in Port Gibson, Mississippi. Most successful boycott almost sent NAACP to bankruptcy. 1979 through 1982. The black community got fed up with being treated bad in that 80% black county, and they boycotted the town. They sent every business downtown Port Gibson into bankruptcy. Every business. If you went and tried to shop, then NAACP had to boycott. The Deacons of Defense have seen you around the corner to make sure you didn't go shop again. And as a result of that, all the businesses downtown, for the most part, are black-owned now. It's a poor county, but that's a success. It almost sent us into bankruptcy. We don't boycott anymore. We have selective buying campaigns now.
Yeah.
But those are the stories we need to begin to highlight. That was about public policy. What we didn't handle successfully was how to get there to help that community manage that school district that they now control, manage those tax dollars that they now control. Detroit, Michigan was a success that we dropped the ball on. DC and Atlanta was so successful, so many black folks made money that we left the inner city political basis and moved to the suburbs. Now we're about to lose DC and Atlanta. Because we made so much money, we're gonna go get a big house as opposed to reinvest in the communities. Because where we're seeing blight, others see opportunities for redevelopment, and so we go chase and buy their old houses while they build new skyscrapers. So we have to understand that in this game of power and policy, if you accumulate power through the vote, you have to be able to successfully manage the policy to continue to empower for our legacy.
Now, sisters and brothers, I am going to have my card as an educator taken away from me if I don't encourage you to talk about education.
Yes.
Absolutely.
To talk about the resegregation of America's schools at an alarming rate. To say, if you want to know how you will get educated, show me your zip code.
Hello.
Talk about this. Mary McLeod Bethune told us for her time, education is the prime need of the hour. And talk about education, not just in our schools, but perpetual education we must do of ourselves.
So what's fascinating here is, and let's do it without getting caught into this distracting conversations of charter versus public. That's a game people are running on us. Neither are providing for black children the way they should provide for black children. But NAACP, we've filed tens of thousands of law schools against public education systems, and we're going to continue to call out charter schools that are raping our tax dollars over the coal, exploiting black families who are seeking another way out. They're both failing us. The issue with education in this country is based on the needs of the local industries in those communities. So if a local industry needs a cheap labor force, guess what? They dummy down the education systems so kids will not have higher aspirations so they can keep cheap labor. If the kids don't look like the folks who they think should be valued, then they cast them out. I'm a product of Detroit Public Schools. And as a result of that, my subjects and verbs are still fighting each other all the time. But I do know in that public school system, I had a set of black teachers who cared and loved me, and that's why they sent me to Tougaloo College. And it was at that HBCU that I learned the wherewithal to sit here today. And if we don't invest in our black teachers to teach in our black schools so our black kids can see a better reality, we're going to get an outcome where our black kids are going to be something less than what they should be.
So I think we need to put our money where our mouth is. And as long as we have an education system that is funded based on local tax structures, and we haven't addressed the systematic issues that caused high concentrations of poverty in black communities, and we will never fix the fact that your education depends on what zip code you're in if we continue to say the locality is going to bear all of the burden of paying for the education system. I'm going to disagree a little bit. The dumbing down of our schools was not just to have a workforce. It was so we wouldn't ask questions. It was so we wouldn't know our history and challenge our history. And this is the only time you're going to hear me today quote Thomas Jefferson, but he did understand that an educated voter base was key to a democratic republic. So who got educated? The people they wanted to be in power. And the ones they didn't weren't even allowed to read. It was illegal to teach them how to read. So we already talked about how everything is connected. The state of our education system is directly related to the state of our government and how representative it is, and who shows up to vote and who doesn't, to our health outcomes. And if we don't put our money where our mouth is and have a real honest conversation about our tax structure and who pays for what, we're never going to fix any of these problems.
Yeah, I want to
not just the law come in a minute and then you do, yeah.
add this point, because let me, I think it's very important when we talk about these issues is to create the right context. So the truth of the matter is that the black high school graduation rate is up. And I don't say that to say things are good. I say that because we also have to mark and note progress, even if it's infinitesimal, even if it's small. One of the things that concerns me greatly today, I looked at this very recently, and it's kind of a tricky set of situations, right? So I looked at the college graduation rate, right? So on the overall basis for black people, there are more African Americans in 2 or 4 year colleges today than ever before. The college graduation rate is slightly higher than it has been. But when you look at the number of African Americans in colleges and universities today, where the numbers have increased significantly are the number of African Americans who are attending 2-year colleges, 2-year community colleges. The numbers of African Americans who are attending so-called top-tier schools, that number has been stagnant for almost 30 years. When you look at the number of African Americans who are attending public universities, public 4-year universities, those numbers are up very slightly. The college affordability crisis and the college debt crisis dramatically impacts black people.
Yes.
And what it is causing so many of our young people, in some instances, to shy away when they have the wherewithal and the intelligence from attending a college because of the unwillingness to take on all of this crushing debt. It also means that we have many, and this is a challenge many of the historically black colleges and universities face, is that young people will go for freshman year, maybe they'll go for sophomore year, then they can't come back for junior year or senior year. So one of the issues we've got to put front and center, right, in terms of what goes on in this town and what goes on in state capitals is the idea of college affordability and dealing with the college debt crisis. I want to note, and this is the power of local government, just noted this yesterday, the mayor of Birmingham, Randall Woodfin, just enacted a new program where anyone who goes to the Birmingham public schools from kindergarten through 12th grade and graduates will get an opportunity to go to the state's public 2 or 4 year colleges for free.
Amazing.
See, this is an example. This is an example of why what the senator here has been talking about, the power of state and local government. And so I want to also lift up some of the assets we have as a community. One of the assets we have as a community is this incredible rise of the number of African American women who are serving as mayors of major American cities today. You've got Washington, you've got Charlotte, you've got Atlanta, you've got New Orleans, you've got Chicago, you've got San Francisco, just to name a few. When I served as mayor of New Orleans in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was only one African American woman mayor of a major American city, and that was Sharon Sales Belton, who was a mayor of Minneapolis, Minnesota. We need to, as we think about the challenges we face, to note the weapons in our arsenal, the assets that we have, the tools that we're working with. We represent today 1.5 trillion in spending in this country. 1.5 trillion of an almost $19 trillion economy. But how does that fare? Do you realize that the entire economy of the Russian Federation, that's Vladimir Putin's economy, is only about 1.7 trillion, not much larger than the entire spending power of black people in America today. So I want us to also focus that as we confront these challenges, we're not without weapons, we're not without power, we're not without the ability. We have more African American state legislators than ever before in the history of the Republic. And we've got power at the state levels. We've got power at the local levels. In Virginia, they're a seat away from tipping both houses of the Virginia State Legislature. A seat away.
Mark, I'm going to just interrupt you for a second because I want to get back to education here, which Sister Prez had raised, and which is really important. I'm glad that my colleagues have mentioned college affordability and our HBCUs, but I think we have to begin at the beginning.
Yes.
And the beginning is that many of our young people are not in preschool, Head Start, or any of those things. We have never fully funded Head Start. So half of the young people who qualify for Head Start don't have it, and about 2/3 of young black children are not in pre-K programs. So we're starting off at a deficit. There's all this research done about that. This could be funded, but we have to have the premise that every child can learn. If we believe that every child can learn, then we can fund the right kind of pre-K and K programs that we need. Moving on, I mean, when we talk about the K through 12, and we don't have time, Dr. Cole is standing up, that's a signal, he'd be quiet. I wanted her to stand up on Mark, but she wasn't gonna do that. But anyway.
But if I can make one quick point.
I wasn't finished, sister, with all due respect. With all due respect,
no,
because the education piece, really, we would be remiss. Education has been the fulcrum of how we've made our progress. And so when we look at the K through 12 piece, we've got to uncouple school finance from taxation. Just the most important. When we begin to do that, we begin to look at having equal education as opposed to zip code-based education.
Dr. Patrice,
And how we, yes.
you have
One minute.
Yes.
The other point I want to make in the education system, I'm glad you talked about debt, because as we look at the number of African Americans who are going to medical school, it is certainly impacted by the high debt load. One thing in K through 12, we also have to make sure supports are there. I'm worried about the young black girls and boys that are getting labeled. I am a child psychiatrist and I see that. Now, they do have PTSD, they do have ADHD, but they are getting labeled as troublemakers.
Yeah, disruptive.
And are not getting the services that they need. So that's another key point we need to look at in K to 12.
Was that not amazing as a conversation? We're going to turn now to Q&A. But my sisters and my brothers, this is an interactive session. We are asking that if you're writing a doctoral dissertation, you not present the summary here. And whatever is your faith tradition, and maybe you don't have one, this is not the time to testify. We're going to really ask that we do this respectfully, that you pose your question, and that you do that either directed to all of our sister and brother panelists or to the individual you'd like to address your question. We're ready.
Good morning. My name is Beverly Smith, and this is directed to the whole panel. As you can see, I have a skin disorder called vitiligo. Many of you may not know what it is, but the doctor up there really knows. But my question is, since my beautiful brown skin is fading away and I'm turning white, I don't want our history to fade away. So, Mr. Johnson and Mark Mariel, when you're on the TV shows on Sunday mornings, could you bring in some of that history that we're celebrating for 400 years So let them know that this country has been built on the backs of slaves because you.
Thank you, sister. We got your question. We heard it.
And sister, please refer to us as enslaved people, as opposed to slaves. Enslaved people, please.
Thank you.
So,
and hold up, we need to be respectful. You heard the question. All you have to say is you agree that you will continue to raise our history and her story.
Yes.
All right, next question.
Yes, thank you so much for everyone's input. I've been totally blessed because the conversation has been straightforward, not beat around the bush type of conversation, very empowering and inspiring. So someone mentioned, I think a couple of you mentioned about elected officials keep electing these officials that not necessarily are putting our interests, Black people interest at the forefront, and that picking the lesser of the two evils. So why is it, do you think, that the Black community continues to elect these people year after year after year after year because they have been elected in times past that don't necessarily represent us as Black people with Black faces?
We got your question. Who's willing to respond?
So let's be clear, that is not a uniquely Black problem.
Hello.
The real question is, how do we get local communities to put in accountability metrics in place to hold elected officials accountable? Elections are nothing more than popularity contests, and it's only the start of the process. Managing success successfully is once you get control of the office, what is the agenda you are walking in that office with that's informed by the community that the community holding that elected official accountable to. We have not done that well as a community. That has not been done well as a nation.
Well, voting is not the most you can do, it's the least that you can do.
Yes.
Once you voted for someone, you got them in office, you need to hold them accountable time and again. Too many of us don't hold our elected officials accountable, and let me close by saying everybody Brown ain't down.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we need to be recruiting more people to run against them.
Yes.
But I'll say this, and I was going to use an example when I was in office, and there was a major issue that involved equity and African American contracting. But the actual control of the agency that controlled these contracts was not under the mayor. It was a state agency. Now, it was an agency over which I had influence, but not control. And so we were trying to move them and push them. Well, what became clear is we needed public pressure. We needed an inside and an outside strategy. So I quietly asked the activists in the community and the activist ministers
to stir it up,
to not only make noise, but to picket, to elevate the issue and create pressure. Because I needed more leverage. I didn't have the leverage I needed in order to be able to impact the issue in the way that we can. So sometimes you can elect an elected official and they don't have total leverage over the issue. And I think Sister Malvo said this, voting alone is not enough. We can't vote and then go sit at home. And I saw this phenomenon to some extent.
Mark, try to wrap it so
the Obama administration,
more.
Which was we elected the president, now we're going to go home and watch him score touchdowns on TV. So we've got to understand the dynamism of the civic process, that activism and the electoral politics are not at odds with each other. Mm-hmm. They're both important methods and strategies to move the needle and move an agenda.
Please, brother.
Yeah.
We're going to let the next question.
My name is Travis Nelson. I'm a DNC member from Portland, Oregon. Black people, Black women specifically, have been the backbone of the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party has not always reciprocated that loyalty. I'd like to know your thoughts on what we as grassroots voters and members of the Black community can do to hold the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, for that matter, accountable to being responsive to our needs.
You're a member of the DNC?
I am.
Tell the DNC, have the DNC invest dollars and money into African American organizing African American get out the vote efforts, African American women candidates. And I think that it starts with understanding that the party apparatus to which we've been exceedingly loyal as a people, right, has not reciprocated. I don't want to just hear a lot of words and speeches. I want to see a recognition that when you look at the so-called coalition of the Democratic Party in America, that probably as many as a third, 25% to a third of its voters are African American. 40% of its voters are people of color. I want to see that percentage of money invested in those communities to not only get out the vote, money invested in those candidates. This is where the change needs to occur. And for too long, to be quite honest, we've allowed the conversation to only operate behind closed doors. It's got to be out in the open. So in this context, the Democratic establishment, the Democratic Party, the Democratic dollars have to be more accountable. Now, it's a long conversation about the Republican Party.
Ask you to wrap it because I'm looking at the line of folks.
I only want to say respect.
No.
Brother, you are on the DNC.
That's
so
right.
frankly, I hold you accountable.
Yes.
I mean, you and your fellow DNC members need to be raising the question about why the DNC does not value black women.
Okay.
Because you got to understand, parties are vehicles for agenda.
Yeah.
They don't carry our agenda.
And support black women candidates.
There you go.
Next question, please.
Brenda Seiler with the Carol H. Williams Advertising Agency. You're right, voting is not the only way. Let's talk about census 2020.
Yes.
Urban League, NAACP, National Council of Negro Women. You all are all on committees. Can we talk about that, please? Hear your comments.
How much?
I can certainly speak for the National Council of Negro Women to say that we stand in strong affirmation of our right to be counted, but we've got to be willing to be counted, because when we are counted, many policies, programs are based on that count. Can you say something quickly?
I'll just say, for the benefit of the community, Derek and I and the National Council, we've created the Black Census Roundtable, which is an umbrella organization that's working on census issues. We're going to be hosting by telephone probably in October. We'll probably try to do another one in the spring, a national town hall by telephone that people will be able to call into, where we will discuss the census. I want to just put one issue on everyone. Where the undercount in 2010 was most severe in the African American community was the undercount of our children, the undercount of our children. If we fully count the children in our households, we can dramatically do better to ensure a complete count. Now, there's a lot the Census Bureau has to do. What I am concerned about is whether the Census Bureau is going to follow through to ensure that they have enough door knockers to go out in these communities to knock on the door to ensure that people are counted. Because here's the point. They've got, this time, they'll have an online option, they'll have a paper option, and they'll have a phone option. Even with all of that, 50% of us historically wait until the door knocker comes and asks us who and how many people live in this house. 50% of African Americans, 40% of white Americans wait for the door knocker to come. In order for that side of the program to be successful, they've got to hire 500,000 people, and they've got to deploy them in neighborhoods across the nation. So we got a lot of work to do on the census, but we need to be, as Sister Janetta said, empowered to make it our business that to be counted empowers us politically and economically.
Okay. Next question, please.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for this panel. My name is Barrington Salmon. I'm a reporter, freelance writer with Final Call and other newspapers. It's a two-part question, short.
No, quick, one question.
For the senator, with the way that Republicans are dealing with maintaining power, breaking every rule, doing what they want, what is it that Democrats need to do to make what they're doing more efficient and make our votes count?
We need to learn how to play chess and stop playing checkers.
Yes.
What did she say?
Done. The question has been answered. Please.
Good morning. My name is Michael Blackson, and I attend Thurgood Marshall High School. I would like to know, what would you say to the people who make claims against reparation, and how do we convince people to take it seriously?
All right, you heard Dr. Malveaux speak to that. Is there something specific you need her to say again?
Yeah, like how would I negate a person who does not agree with reparation?
There's a reparations toolkit on the website ibw21.org. Check out the toolkit. I could continue to talk, but check out the toolkit. And guess what, my young brother? See me on the side afterwards. I'll talk to you for a minute.
There we go. We're ready, my sister.
My name is Joyce Robinson Paul. I'm a DC resident, and I'm speaking briefly on statehood. Why? Why haven't we voted to give 700,000 people in the District of Columbia representation in the House and the Senate? We will have a vote.
All right,
on
we heard the
House.
question.
Okay.
Let's get some responses.
Okay.
Power.
Yeah.
There is no interest in conceding to that type of black power, but that black power must continue to fight to get representation.
But guess
Because
what?
when we fight, we win. That's all we can do on that question. Let's be respectful. Folk really want to pose a question. My sister.
Hi, my name is Sarah Hilton. I go to Laney College, and I'm a senator on the ASLC. And my question is for Ms. Harris. So I have a brother that is healing from autism right now, and he actually got autism after he received vaccinations when he was a baby. And well, my question is right now he's currently not enrolled into school because the OUSD system, it fails students, the regular students. So the students that are in special ed departments are often like being abused, and that's stopped him from being in school for the past 2 years. So my question to you is, do you have any resources for black boys who have autism?
So respectfully, sister, the science does not support that vaccines cause autism. I'm so sorry. I know it's a tough diagnosis for a family to deal with, but we really have to make sure there is not any misperception. Vaccines save so many lives. So I really want to respectfully correct that regarding the science. But as a child psychiatrist, I know that that's a tough diagnosis, and I hope that your family and your brother have a physician, your pediatrician, your family physician that's working with you on that. We do not have enough resources in the schools, so we're talking about education. We need to make sure that we have a wide variety of services for those who learn differently and have different abilities. And so that's the advocacy on the state and local level in the school system that we need to continue to work towards.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for no, my sister, respectfully, we thank you. Can we have the next question, please?
Good morning. My name is Dr. Clady Spears. I'm a proud veteran of the United States Marine Corps. My question to the panel is, where is the armed force members in the conversation? What topics, the issues that we deal with as active duty as well as veterans, and ensuring that they vote? Because many times, once we put that uniform on, we do not do the absentee ballot, we do not vote, just because we get engaged with the duties of serving our country.
Can someone respond? Eric?
I can say we are actively looking for that type of input on how we can strengthen our voter participation program. I just spoke in Alaska. We have a branch there, and it's all active and retired military. and this was a part of the conversation. So I invite you to help inform the best ways we can support that issue.
Thank you. Well done. Yes.
Hi, my name is Dr. Janine Abrams McLean, and I'm the program director at Fair Count, which was started by my sister Stacey Abrams to ensure fair and accurate census. As we just heard, children, particularly Black and brown children, are one of the most undercounted groups. My question is for Dr. Harris. What can the medical community do to impact and engage parents well, basically parents to make sure that their children are counted? So what are some ways that you think the medical community can work with us to ensure an accurate census?
Well, and I'll just speak for myself and my own personal experience. I do talk with my patients and their parents about how to engage if they see a lack of services. And one way to engage, and of course, one way to engage is to make sure you're counted. When you have accurate counts, you have better funding, so you can have services for what children and parents need. I talk to some of my adolescent boys about their risks of getting pulled over. So, you know, we do appreciate in the medical community that there are these social determinants of health. 80% determine health outcomes other than what happens in our physicians' offices. So we do talk to our families about those issues.
Thank you. We are really at almost the end, so put your question very succinctly, please.
No problem. Good morning. My name is Casey Thomas. I'm on the City Council in Dallas, Texas. My question is, how do we prepare the next generation of activists and elected officials?
You know, there are several pipelining programs where young people will go through this Congressional Black Caucus Institute. They have a political boot camp. In ACP, we have a Next Gen program. The Urban League have a Young Professionals. So there are several pipelining programs. And for some of you can look at our website. I can talk to you afterwards, but that's the goal, is for both elected officials, civic leaders, and corporate leaders.
And I think it's also on us, the elected officials, to make sure we are identifying people that we can train up ourselves, bringing them in to work with us, and not hold on to power so much and share that power.
Yes.
Please.
Hi, my name is Obi Anoha. I'm the Vice President of Administration at Berkeley City College, and I had a question regarding voter suppression. So for me, I have the power right now to organize my school to vote, and I want to know what strategy should I use to play chess, not checkers, to organize my school to vote.
I think first you need to understand the laws and the rules and make sure that you are thinking strategically about how many people can you register, where are they, meet them where they are, tell them what's important, why they need to vote and how it affects their everyday life, and then you just keep at it and don't give up. Even if you get discouraged that people aren't responsive immediately, you keep at it, you keep at it, you keep at it.
Please.
Hello, my name is Samantha Biketti. I attend the University of Michigan, and my question is about climate change. So my question is, what is the role of the Black community in the climate change crisis, as many coastal universities and urban communities will be heavily affected by the coming crisis?
I mean, look, climate change is going to affect everyone. The change in the climate is already beginning to affect us in significant ways. All one need do is look at the intensity and the power of hurricanes and storms, which are being, ginned up by the fact that the waters in the Gulf of Mexico are just a tad bit warmer because of this issue. I think we have an important role to play. But here's the point, right? There's a conversation about climate change that's crucially important. But I don't want the conversation about climate change to distract from the need for us to be concerned about the climate of the economy, the climate on race, the climate on voter suppression, and all of these other issues. So I think it's crucially important. The most important revelation for anyone who doesn't understand climate change is to be educated about how modest changes, right, modest changes in the temperature of the earth, which occur because this sort of firmament that sits above us, this sort of zone that sits above us is eroding because of the use of fossil fuels, can impact us in so many, many ways. Look at these temperatures in the West that exceed 100 degrees. That's a phenomenon that is brand new. So I think what we have to do is, I think our community needs to be better educated. We have to do a better job to educate ourselves about climate change. And in many respects, sometimes we're so close to issues that are so immediate in our lives that something like climate change doesn't get the same discussion or the same prominence. But make no mistake about it, and my point of view is every issue is the black community's issue.
Perfect. Here's where we are, sisters and brothers. We are really out of time. I'm going to have to ask only 3 people who are in line. Give us your questions. Then, if the panelists can do their best to respond to all 3. And my deepest apologies to the sisters and brothers who are not able to pose a question. Your question?
Good morning. My name is Debbie Lewis-Son. I'm the founder of I Am Her Too organization in Miami-Dade County. I was a former officer for 12 years with Miami-Dade Police Department, and I was unlawfully terminated due to bringing the issue of racism and discrimination against black officers in the police department. My question is about accountability. We have reached out to commissioners and decision makers about the issue. They either turn their back or do not respond to us. How can we hold them accountable?
Thank you. We're going to see what we can do with your question. The next.
Good morning. My name is Shanice Dominique. I'm a part of the Global Legacy Academy, and I'm currently a Bowie State University student. And my question for the panel is, how can you guys influence college tuition to be affordable so college students can start and not get stuck being able and allowed to finish college?
Serious question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, usually I want a sister to have the last word, but brother, you've got it.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Josiah Weeks. I'm a tenant of Bowie State. I'm a freshman at Bowie State University, and I am a part of the Global Leadership Academy. My question is about the mental health of the youth in America, and I would want to ask, what is your plan for the next generation? Because as you can see, we are the amount of healthcare and services that are provided to African American youth within our teenagers and young, below, isn't very prominent. And I feel as though that's a very turbulent issue, and I feel like that should be something that should be focused, very top priority, because that is our next generation of everything, essentially. And without that mental health, the services to be provided, I feel as though without that, we won't have the future of everything.
We heard you. We heard you. We heard you.
I appreciate that.
Do a miracle. Do the best you can. Try to respond to these 3 questions.
I would like to respond to the sister who raised a question about police accountability, and to say that we need to make sure, and there should be federal legislation, that every jurisdiction that has a police force also has a citizen accountability board. Many do not, the majority do not. And we need to have citizens responding, not just individuals responding. And I'm sorry about what happened in your situation.
Well done.
So I'd say prevention, first of all, for mental health services in the schools. We need to make sure that parity laws are enforced. Parity's been on the books for 10 years, but a lot of insurers are not paying for mental health services. We need to make sure we continue to reduce the stigma. We shouldn't hear that if you have depression or anxiety, you're weak, or you're flawed morally. So lots of things to do, but those are just a few high points.
And
so I'll say this. Y'all remember that big, fat, rich man's tax cut they pushed through? The cost of that is $150 billion a year, or over a 10-year period, $1.5 trillion. If you roll that back, for half of the amount, you could provide free college for every student who needs it in the United States. We have to understand that some of these issues are just issues of priority and what is important. So if you roll that thing back all the way, you could, 1, spend half of the money to enhance college education and half of the money on infrastructure. That's how deeply offensive and expensive that $1.5 trillion tax cut is. So when people say, where are we and how are we going to afford these things? It's just simply a matter of ordering our priorities and having the political will to do what is important.
All right.
So
Now,
just real quick.
come on, Derek.
If you want to work with us for this year's election, next year's election, helping us get infrequent voters engaged, text to this number, 40649, the word vote. We can also answer some of these questions moving forward. So please join us for the elections this year, Virginia, New Jersey, Mississippi, Louisiana, Kentucky, and next year's presidential election. Text to the number 40649, the word vote, and we will continue the conversation with you.
Now, my brother Jerry tells me we must bring closure. Here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to ask everyone who can, and it is with my appreciation that we have different abilities, physically and cognitively. Everyone who can, please stand, including our panelists. I'm going to ask you to feel as comfortable as you can. Whatever's that stance, put your stuff down. Put your stuff down.
It won't.
Or it's only a pen.
Microphone.
Okay.
Stuff is a pen.
Now I'm going to ask you to take your right hand and bring it across your body and find a place between the shoulder and your elbow. Okay? Now take your left hand, bring it across your body and try to be symmetrical where you've got your two hands. Are you comfortable? Okay, now, I want you to hug yourself. And some folk are rocking as they hug. I'm asking you to hug yourself because we've got to begin by loving ourselves. Now turn and ask for permission to hug somebody near you.
Hey.
Yes,
Come on, we can have a group hug. We ain't gonna leave you out.
The group hug.
Because
let's have a big group hug. Come on, Mark.
Look at him. Look at him. Wait. Because if we don't love ourselves and love each other, what kind of world are we going to leave for our children? Thank you all. Bye-bye.